I'm going to talk, as the title says, about Chicago's Italian communities, or Chicago's Italians and the Chicago Area Project. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Chicago Area Project, but if you're not, the Chicago Area Project was created around 1930 by Clifford Shaw and members of the Illinois Institute for Juvenile Research, and they were really the beginning of modern sociology. Their research, as we talked about this morning, led to a new paradigm where we started to look at social structural causes of crime as opposed to the work of Lombardo and these atavistic tendencies and the biological problems that people have. What we don't know, what the public typically doesn't realize, is that so much of their work occurred in Chicago's Italian communities. So much of what we know, commonly believe about criminology today, is based upon their research in Chicago's Italian communities, 3 in particular. So I would like to talk about that. And I'd like to talk about who I would consider the unsung heroes of the Italian community that worked against very adversarial conditions to keep their young people out of delinquency. Because the Italian communities were located in Chicago's river wards, and the connotation of that is that they had adult criminals, they had vice districts. People there faced problems not faced anywhere else in the city of Chicago. We hear about Italian gangsters, but we never hear about these non-Italian sociologists and their teams of all inner-city Italian Americans who fought crime sociologically through this Chicago Area Project. And that's a picture of Clifford Shaw. I'm sure most of you have heard his name. I never knew until I did this research that he was 6'4" tall. He is a giant of a man. The project began in 1932, like I said, at the Institute for Juvenile Research on the west side at the Illinois Medical Center District. Most people equate Sean McKay with the Chicago School of Sociology. The interesting thing is their work didn't stem from the University of Chicago, but stemmed from the University of Illinois' medical campus on the west side of Chicago. Clifford Shaw himself, probably one of the most prominent sociologists in the history of sociology and criminology, never finished his PhD. He had a master's degree when he did all this groundbreaking, incredible work. The whole idea of the project was to fight delinquency, and the very first project was on the south side in a Polish neighborhood at Russell Square, around 83rd and Commercial. Russell Square Park still exists there today. And as a result of that work, he published his famous book, The Jack Roller, in 1930. These are the members of the Institute for Juvenile Research, and again, there's some very famous sociologists here. The first person, Nathan Berman, I don't really know. Emo Peluso, the next fella, was the Italian street worker from Taylor Street, the west side of Chicago. He remained in this job for 40 years. Peter Less and Henry Martinez, I didn't know them, nor the female. However, Harold Feinstone, sociologist, and Solomon Cobrin, protégés of Sean McKay, are very prominent in the history of sociology. They're two of the most famous criminology in the history of the literature. And they all began working there on the west side of Chicago. Chicago Area Project sought to fight juvenile delinquency by reversing social disorganization. Social disorganization was a new term created to essentially describe the conditions that these young people lived under that contributed to crime. Bad housing, poverty, tuberculosis, mental disorder, overcrowding, unemployment, adult crime. And even still today, social disorganization theory is still one of the most prominent theories of criminology. The variables are operationalized a little different today, but historically these were the ones that they found to be correlated or related to higher rates of juvenile delinquency throughout the city. Another interesting thing is that between 1924 and 1926, 1 out of every 4 West Side boys, 17 to 21 years of age, faced felony criminal charges. That's astounding. 1 out of every 4 had appeared in juvenile court for committing felonies. And the west side of Chicago was largely Italian. Of course, there was some Irish and Jewish neighborhoods as well. Some of you may recognize this. This is a modern reproduction of Sean McKay's, and McKay was his associate in this research, their map of juvenile delinquency. They essentially mapped approximately 100,000 arrests over a 20-year period into juvenile court in Cook County, and they discovered that delinquency rates decreased as people moved further from the center of the city. And it was in the center of the city, you'll see zone 2 there, 12.9. Of course, 24.5 is higher in the loop, but it was a transient area. People didn't really live there, and this largely represented shoplifting down at Marshall Fields and stores like that. So the real information, the real study was in what we call the river wards there. You can see how the rivers were there. And these were the original early pioneer wards of the city of Chicago. These are the areas where Chicago's vice districts developed after the Civil War and continued all the way up until around, well, till modern times, actually very modern times. So why is this important to us? Why is it important sociologically? Again, much of what we know about juvenile delinquency and this term delinquency areas that these authors created, and the cultural transmission of delinquency values, which is an important concept in the criminology literature, is based upon research that was not necessarily began, but carried on and conducted in Chicago's Italian neighborhoods. Yet there is no mention anywhere in the literature of the Italian community's contributions or participation in this, or the effort that they put forward to challenge and solve these problems. Nor is there mention that organized criminal activity was a necessary element. As we get into this, you'll see that adult crime was present in all these communities. Yet when you read research, and even Shaw's own research, there's very little mention of adult criminality. Coburn and some of his students talk about it extensively, but he never really did, except for the Wickersham Commission report in National Commission on the Observance of Violence, the study of prohibition. In there, he talks about juvenile delinquency in the major cities of the United States is directly related to the presence of adult criminals in these inner city community areas. So the next 3 communities that participated in CAP, the Chicago Area Project, were 3 Chicago Italian communities. Matter of fact, the 3 most prominent, of course, we had a 4th on the south side in Armour Square, and we had Chicago Heights way out in the suburbs. But at this period of time, the 3 river ward Italian communities were the north side, the west side, and the northwest side, which each began these sociological programs to fight delinquency. The north side was the first in 1935, and for those of you familiar with Chicago, we just lost Cabrini Green housing development. It was torn down. Well, prior to Cabrini Green, in 1950, the city of Chicago tore down Chicago's Little Sicily, the Sicilian community, in order to build public housing at that location. So I want to talk about each one of these groups. And again, what made them different, they were located in what repeated people have described as the river wards of Chicago. And nowhere else did the residents have to face what Anthony Sorrentino of the West Side Community Committee called more significant elements. And what were these more significant elements? Machine politics, adolescent gangs, presence of adult criminals, and established vice districts. These were the inner city wards, the inner city communities. These were the ones that built up around the loop. These were the ones that contained vice districts, gambling houses, houses of prostitution, burlesque shows, taverns. Did I say gambling guns? The northwest and south side of Chicago each had what was called a levee district. Of course, the most prominent of which was the south side levee, which isn't coincidentally included in this. So let's talk about the North Side Civic Committee first. They served the area that became Cabrini Green. They served what was known as Little Sicily, and typically Chicago to Division and Sedgwick to the river. was Little Sicily, and the larger area, Division to North Avenue and LaSalle Street to the river. And this was a map of actually Black Hand crimes that had Black Hand extortions that occurred in Little Sicily with all those little dots that you see there in and around what came to be known as Death Corner. Little Sicily was described by Harvey Zorbo in his famous book, The Go Close and the Slum, as Little Hell, and he described it as the greatest concentration of poverty in Chicago. Tenement housing, lot crowding, unemployment, lack of recreational facilities, and crime. And again, we're talking about the early 1900s. This is a water gas plant that was located at Crosby in Division, and water gas, back in these days, gas used for cooking and for lighting in the house was created by pouring water from the Chicago River over coal. Burning coal, and it was stored in these tanks that as they filled up, and these tanks could be seen around the city, as they filled up with gas, they'd raise, and then as they emptied, they'd go back down into the ground. Well, the fires, the crackling of the coal, the way the sky was lit up at night with the red glow from the plant contributed or is allegedly the source of this term, Little Hell. People that lived in the neighborhood heard this noise constantly and saw fire in the sky. These more significant elements that Anthony Sorrentino talked about was Black Hand crime, and the Black Hand wasn't a criminal organization. It was just a method of crime like armed robbery, auto theft, carjacking, what have you. Prohibition, they had the Aiello brothers. The interesting thing about the Italian prohibition gangs around the city, both the Aiello brothers and the Jenna brothers on Taylor Street, as well as some others out in Chicago Heights, all had businesses where they could purchase sugar. The Aiellos owned a bakery. The Jennas had a license to import sugar from Cuba for other purposes before Prohibition, and the people in Chicago Heights owned bakeries also. So it's kind of interesting how some Italians got involved in bootlegging because of their access to sugar. There was the Clark Street Rialto, Clark Street from the river going north. North was a vice district, again, burlesque houses, girly shows, gambling dens. Machine politics dominated the area. Early on, Hot Stove Jimmy Quinn was the alderman. They called him Hot Stove because he was so crooked he'd steal a burning stove. Later on, Patty Bauer in the 50s was the alderman. The Gloriana gang existed there, young toughs described by the police department as the most dangerous young people in the city of Chicago, burglars and armed robbers and hijackers, many of whom eventually were recruited into the Capone mob and formed the North Side Crew. So as you can see, young people growing up in this area were faced with challenges that our children have never been faced with, and children in the other 47 wards of the city of Chicago did not have to face. However, Little Sicily also had a very strong social organization. According to research conducted by the University of Chicago at this period of time, there were fewer cases of family desertion amongst Chicago Sicilian than any other ethnic group. Few street beggars, the people were sober, the men were sober. Children worked after school, mothers took in work. They were religious, family loyalty, campanilismo. They lived in a community group around their church, which was St. Philip Benizi. And this is a picture of the Reverend Luigi Giambastiani, who is famous in Italian history in Chicago. He was the pastor there for nearly 50 years. And I had done research on Black Hand crime in Chicago. When the police arrested a Black Hand offender, they couldn't get him to talk, and he pretended to only speak Italian. What did they do? They probably hit him with a phone book a few times first. But they'd call Father Louis. Father Louis would go in a room with him by himself, and he'd talk to him and redeem him and get him to cooperate with the police. So he was a very famous man in Chicago history. 1935, Angelo Landino, a local dentist, a member of the Owls Indian Social Athletic Club. Now, when we think about these Italian communities at this period of time, all we think about is gangsters. But you had groups like the Owl Indians, young people, 20 years old, young professional people like Doc Landino, who tried to do good in their community and organize themselves to help poor people and help kids. And they were approached by the Chicago Area Project and asked to begin a project within their community. And he did. Eventually, 3,100 boys and girls participated in their programs: scouting, Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, summer camps, sports, recreation, employment. Doc Landino became such a prominent figure in the near North Side that he attempted to run for alderman. He was told by the gangsters not to because he was an honest man. There was still plenty of illegal activity there. And I knew Doc Landino as a kid, and never did I know about all his famous history. And I know his son to this day, and his son will tell you that Doc wasn't threatened. Doc was just told, Doc, you're an honest guy, don't get involved. So he withdrew from the alderman's race. Northside Civic Committee, the neighborhood boys, this is a picture of the neighborhood boys cleaning the 3rd floor of the old Hudson Avenue Police Station to use as a craft room. Just an example of the types of things that the kids were involved in. Bruce Sumo grew up during this period, became a doctor. He wrote this book, Little Sicily, and his famous quote was, he didn't know that he lived in a slum until he went to college and read Sorbo's book. So you can see, though, that even though the neighborhood suffered from these conditions of social disorganization, the neighborhood had a unique social organization of its own that was tied essentially to the Italian or the Sicilian community. The next community to join the Chicago Area Project was the West Side, Taylor Street. Served the area from Congress to Roosevelt, and from Halsted to Rockwell, and of course the heart of the area was Little Italy. This was truly Little Italy. The North Side was Little Sicily. People get confused, and it's been such a long time since we had a Little Sicily, people forget. But there was definitely a distinction. And following the whole Chicago School of Sociology paradigm, the Near West Side Community Committee argued that their neighborhood was socially disorganized. Poor housing, lack of sanitation, low rents, welfare dependency, infant mortality, tuberculosis, poverty, poor schools, unemployment, and adult criminals. And again, we're talking about this began in the 1930s, right at the end of Prohibition. Prohibition ended in 31, so these kids, these young people there, and certainly the older men in the district had witnessed this crime as they grew up. The more significant elements that existed on Taylor Street were the Jenner brothers that we talked about. They were bootleggers. They had the Madison Street Rialto, another vice district close by. They had machine politics. They had Johnny Powers. He was the dean of the Gray Wolves of the city council. He was Irish, of course, but he had controlled that ward for 30 years or so since it was Irish, and they couldn't depose him. Diamond Joe Esposito led the Italian community. He was a politician and a bootlegger, and eventually murdered for resisting the overtures of the Capone Syndicate. The juvenile gang there was the 42 gang, probably the most famous adolescent street gang in Chicago history. Violent, bad kids, killed 3 policemen in 10 years. Many of them went to prison. Some of them were paroled to fight in World War II. I thought that was interesting. They had 20 years to serve, but they were such good fighters, they put them in the army. And eventually organized crime, an organized crime street crew evolved in there, and it became known as the Taylor Street Crew. So again, young people growing up in this district had examples that mimic of the underworld of crime that didn't exist in other parts of the city. And here's our 42 gang. They lasted from 25 to 34, boys 13 to 50. John Landesco wrote a manuscript that's never been published, and you can find it at the University of Chicago, about the 42 gang, and he argued that the traditions of the gang became the delinquent subculture of the neighborhood. Succeeding generations of young people emulated the delinquent activities of the 42 gang. And just like today, you know, the major gangs in Chicago, let's say the Vice Lords and the Gangster Disciples, their leadership has been decimated by the federal government. So they had various factions. Different geographic areas in the South Side had different factions of the Gangster Disciples, for example. Today, separate. There's no central leadership, but they all still follow the subculture, so to speak, of the GDs. The same thing occurred back then. There were a dozen 42 gang corners in the near west side of Chicago. And they had nothing to do with each other, okay, largely, but they all followed the same routine, so to speak. West Side Community Committee began in '38, and again by another group of young people that sought to better their own community, the Guiding Brothers Club, led by Anthony Sorrentino. And they created all these communities, committees to help their own people. I'm getting a rush, so I need to get through this quickly. They created a camp. They bought a camp, Camp Pompeii, out in Crete, Illinois. Our Lady of Pompeii Church worked with them, helped raise the money. James Short, another noted sociologist, commenting on all the CAP projects, how important local Catholic Church participation was. Moving on to the near west side group around Grand and Ogden, same social disorganization issues, same more significant elements, but they shared the Clark Street and Madison Street vice districts. There was eventually an organized crime crew there. In some ways, they were really an extension of both of the other neighborhoods. They were right in between them. And here's one of the heroes of the Italian community, Daniel Moose Brindisi. He's there in a Boy Scout uniform. He ran the Northwest Side Civic Committee for 50 years. For 50 years. What did they do? They had social centers for young people, dances, they had Boy Scouts. And this is really important. We hear so much about social athletic clubs of young men being detrimental to society. They worked with these clubs, and these clubs did charity work. They did form baseball teams for the young people in the district. So they did many, many positive things. And the motto of CAP was, boy power today is man power tomorrow. Work with them to become productive members of society. And of course, the church worked there. Chicago's Italian, all three of these communities, at least two of them were destroyed by urban renewal. The near northwest side fought the city and won, which is probably the reason we've never had Italians in major office in the city of Chicago. This urban renewal on the north side and on Taylor Street pushed the Italians into the suburbs. Dr. Landino's conclusion, we did have a reputation for crime and delinquency, and at one time the name Little Hell, but our North Side Civic Committee has been cleaning things up. We now have 7 Boy Scout troops. And this applied to all Chicago's Italian communities. It didn't help. Italians were still given the organized crime label, and all the good work that these 3 groups of people did, that the Italian community, the men and women of the community, didn't matter. This reputation for organized crime led to the destruction. What's the sociological significance? William Foote Wright wrote that no one who reads of the activities of this group can help but conclude that Zorbo neglected to see some of the most significant features of the area. And this led to the recognition by criminologists that inner city areas can have a social organization of their own. And as a result, a new term was developed, differential social organization, that exists, continues today in the literature. Thank you.